Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenara Nerenberg, and this is our new series, Divergent Ideas. I'm sitting here with Kurt Gray, who is the author of Outraged, an endowed chair in social psychology at OSU, director of the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, as well as the Deepest Beliefs Lab. Kurt is amazing, and I'm so excited you're here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of catch up. You have just relocated to Ohio. Walk us through, how you drill down to your research interests as well as what you're up to at OSU now.
Sure. Well, I'm Canadian, and I think my interest in how we make sense of politics and morality, which is my main research interest, started, I think, when I guess I got a little older, but that's because when I was five, my dad remarried my stepmom, and she's from Nebraska. She comes from a big conservative evangelical family, and when I was five, we drove down from Nova Scotia, which is on the far east coast of Canada, and we took a K car, a Reliant K, those old Chrysler ones, and we drove across to Nebraska, which is a very long drive in the middle of the summer. And I had a single tape in my Walkman. It was the Everly Brothers, classic country. Anyways, when I got there, these folks were just incredible, right? I was a step kid. I was a foreigner. They were just so welcoming, so warm. I had everything in common with my Nebraskan cousins. We liked swimming in the pond and playing in the hayloft and riding horses. And yet, when I got older, it was clear that we didn't have everything in common when it came to politics, right? The folks that I was surrounded with as a Canadian and as an academic voted more progressive, and they voted more conservative. And yet, what I couldn't do is just write them off, right? Which is what half the country does to each other today, right? Like, oh, they're stupid or they're evil, like this side's dumb, because I knew they weren't dumb and I knew they weren't evil. They were just incredible people and so warm to me. And so I had to figure out, well, how can someone disagree about morality and politics and still be kind, caring people? And that's what led me to my research, which is ultimately like, look, we're all good people. We're all trying to find our way. We're all trying to protect ourselves, which is the core of this idea in Outraged. And that's what can give rise to differences among the similarity.
So, I mean, the question that's coming to my mind right now, and I know you're such an amazing, deep expert in all of this, and we'll get into all of it, but this thought keeps coming up for me, which is that because people do agree on more things than we realize. Do you think that turning to conflict and fighting is serving some other purpose, or like it's almost like people don't know what to do with themselves? Like if we all actually are on the same page more than we realize, that kind of sounds like a little bit of a boring life. Do you have you looked at that at all? Like the function that conflict itself plays?
Right. So we do agree more than we think. It's a great point. We agree about so many things. Like if you opened up a random page in a book of law, we would agree that that law makes sense. Right. Like you shouldn't steal from each other and you shouldn't, defraud the elderly and all these things. Right. We could keep contracts. But I think where we disagree, I think it's still important to take note of those things about, I don't know, abortion, immigration. Although even there, it's like pretty small where we actually disagree, right? If you look at actually like people's policy preferences. But I think why we disagree, and again, like I'm an optimist, is actually a good thing, and that's we're continually striving to make the world better, to make the world safer for ourselves and our families and our communities. And if there's any injustice out there, right, we want to fix that. We're kind of fixated on the threats and the things that are bad in our world, and we want to remedy that so that we can live better. Also, it's kind of how our attention works. And I often like thinking about just like generally how our attention works. And so if you, let's say you got your bathroom floor redone with tiles, right? And all the tiles are perfect except one's like a little crooked, you know? And every time you go into the bathroom, you just like look at that tile and just be like, "Argh," you know? And I feel like this is a little bit where we're at. Like we're fixated on the one thing that we disagree about, and we even don't even disagree that much, but it drives conflict, especially with social media, especially with like politicians trying to like really get us angry at each other. But you're absolutely right. We disagree less than we think.
I think the tile analogy is so great. So thank you for that. It's interesting how our attention is drawn to like, oh, this little thing needs to be fixed. And then that manifests in human relationships on like such a big scale, which is so upsetting. But okay, walk us through one of your main theses in your book, Outraged, which is about the how, like perceptions of moral harm, and just so our listeners know.
Sure. So the big idea in Outraged is that even though it seems like liberals and conservatives have very different values or morals, that we ultimately, if you dig down, a deeper level into our minds, that we have the same moral mind, and that is one that is concerned about harm and protecting ourselves and worried about threats. And so no matter who you vote for, no matter kind of like your political or religious leanings, we're all condemning those acts that seem to cause harm. And this is why we agree about so many things. Again, like murder, wrong, child abuse, wrong, kicking puppies, wrong, right? And where we disagree is about areas where we're not quite sure what exactly the harm is or what the best way is to kind of fix that harm. And so with abortion, everyone agrees that we should protect babies. And everyone agrees that, not everyone, but most people agree that, you can wear a condom and that's not harmful, right? But where we disagree is about, you know, whether we should prioritize the lives and well-being of pregnant women or whether we should prioritize the lives of fetuses, which, turn into babies eventually, and some would argue are even babies from the get-go. And so, this is where the disagreement comes about how best to protect ourselves from harm. And I think this is super useful because it means that liberals and conservatives don't have fundamentally different values that we can never understand the other side. Instead, if we get down to the calculus of harm in someone else's mind, we can understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. Okay. And so how does your research in that area tie in with some of the newer work that you're doing? Because I know you're also looking at AI and sort of broader sociological trends and religion and faith and things like that. How do you blend all of that?
Yeah. Well, so my lab is called the Deepest Beliefs Lab. And so these all cohere, right, with the kind of our deepest beliefs about the world. And, stepping back, this is what got me so interested in social psychology because these things are so important to people, right? Like how people live our lives and things we'll fight for and give money for and even die for. And they're ultimately kind of intangible things. I switched from geophysics, which is about rocks. It's very tangible, right? Less interesting to me.
Wow.
Um, and so I think these do all cohere in that, you know, we as human beings are left to perceive the world, right? We can only kind of make sense of what's happening in the world through our own assumptions, our own worldviews. And these can be about, who's the ultimate intelligence in the universe, right? What happens to our souls after they die? Is a computer conscious? Will it ever be? Right? These are all assumptions that we make about how the world works and ultimately like who really has a mind, right? And like what kind of mind those things have. And so that's how these things all fit together. And if something has a mind, like a machine or like, God, then it brings with it lots of things. Like we think that thing deserves moral rights, and we think maybe we should be afraid of it in some ways, right? So I think this is how it all connects together. Who has a mind and what does that mean?
Okay, that's amazing and sounds like the most fun job in the world. Did you really switch from geophysics? I don't think I knew that.
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, when I was, I mean, talk about an origin story. When I was 16, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and my friend's dad was pretty buff, had a beautiful girlfriend, and he would bow hunt, and so he had a freezer full of moose meat. I grew up in basically the Texas of Canada, in Calgary, and I just thought like, whoa, that's awesome, right? Like he thinks about hard things like, geophysics, and he's got a cool lifestyle and uses like hair pomade. I was using gel and he uses like this like textured pomade. And as a 16-year-old, I was like, that is sophisticated. Like I want to be like this guy. And then I chose geophysics, and then I realized I didn't care about rocks and I wanted to study people instead. And so that led me to psychology. But I'm glad I did it. I can look at some rocks and tell you what they are usually, but I think people are more interesting.
Yes, more dynamic for sure. So what's coming up lately or what's exciting you? What are you, what's like the new frontier right now with all of this? We hear so much about polarization, misinformation. Yeah, what are you thinking about these days?
I mean, I work a lot with practitioners, people who are actively in communities trying to bridge divides. Um, I've been doing that for a few years. I feel like that most academics try to do that, but it's taken me a lot of years to kind of like figure out the language differences among practitioners, kind of what they're all about. And so I'm really excited to be working with them even more. And I think what I'm trying to do is trying to figure out interventions that are scalable,
Mhm.
that can really make people get along better. I mean, I've done a lot of work on how to have better conversations individually. I think it's so important. Holidays are coming up, right? We want to be able to talk to our friends and family without yelling at them. But I think at the end of the day, we want to figure out ways to kind of like go from individual conversations to kind of like broader ecosystems where we can thrive and have better conversations. So I'm really excited about that, partnering with those organizations, and also thinking more about, as everyone is, like AI and LLMs and how to use those better to make our lives better. And not just make like silly poems and silly videos, which like try to find ways to kind of like use the strengths and weaknesses in our minds to kind
Mhm.
of help us grow and thrive as people.
Okay, wow. I need to ask you more about that. That's really interesting. So I want to ask about the first part. So it sounds like one of your goals is to really bridge academia and sort of like more applied settings, and you're working with practitioners. So what are you finding like is actually working as people confront, divergent beliefs?
Yeah, right. Great question. So there are a lot of programs out there that work really well for getting students to talk to each other. I mean,
Mhm.
I've taught classes on this. You provide the right environment, some good ground rules, really focus on kind of curiosity, excitement to learn about differences. And I should say that students are incredible at this. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there that like, oh, students, like they're snowflakes, they can't handle this. I haven't experienced that at all. I mean, you have to get the right infrastructure, right? I mean, you can't just, I don't know, with kids, if you're teaching them to swim, you can't just throw them in the water, right? You have to teach a little bit of the skills and provide the right environment. And so I think if you do that with students, they really thrive. And so we know what works well there. And we know what works well for like one-on-one conversations, like sharing experiences instead of throwing facts at each other, right? Some of this work that I've done with my collaborators. But for kind of like bigger things, I just talked with this organization yesterday, and they're interested in partnering, getting some help from some researchers. They're trying to do nudges on campus, like just change the norms, right?
Mhm.
That argue that people are having these conversations, that people are engaging across differences. And the example I think that's useful is student drinking, right? So for a long time, students thought that everyone on campus was drinking a lot, even though it wasn't true at all. But most people are not getting wasted every night. They're just kind of assuming because there's a couple people who are loud partiers that they should be loud partiers too and get really drunk. But if you just change the norms, it's called pluralistic ignorance. If you just change the norms and say, hey, most people when they go out, they maybe have a drink or two and they drink lots of water and they enjoy themselves and that's it. And so you could do that with civil discourse too, right? Most people they like engaging across differences. They like being exposed to new ideas. And so students then feel like I can too, and that's okay. So that's on campuses, but I'm hoping that we can do that more broadly and change the norms and the kind of what feels appropriate for people across the country.
So interesting. Do you think that that kind of analogy applies to other settings? Like specifically, I'm thinking of social media and how, there's all these um, theories that, it's like the loudest, most extreme voices take up most of the space online on social media, and it's not an accurate reflection of reality. But I think that's confusing because I think some people to your point, some people think that that is reality or that that is the norm. And so it gets confusing, sort of as for a collective or collective sort of republic to figure out what's real, what do people actually believe? Is there more agreement than we realize? So you're using the example of college students that their drinking is not actually that intense. Does that kind of relationship apply in other settings, for example, social media?
It applies perfectly. We overestimate how much the other side hates us, how much they disagree with us. And I think that's driven by cable news, even traditional media, right? Even op-eds kind of inflame some division, but social media is really the worst at it. And the algorithms are designed to, put things in our feed that make us outraged, that make us upset, that kind of fixate our attention. And so it's absolutely the case that we overestimate, this disagreement because of these algorithms. It's exactly like drinking, right? People think like I should
Right.
be outraged too. And I should say some outrage is useful. Some outrage, going
Mhm.
back to what we said earlier, kind of leads us to moral progress. And you should get outraged if Purdue Pharma is getting people addicted to OxyContin, right? And ruining so many lives. It makes sense to be outraged there, but you shouldn't get outraged for good people trying to make tough trade-offs about their lives and their worlds.
Or using like the wrong word.
Exactly. Right?
That's what I think about a lot. Yeah.
Totally. When I give, my book talk to audiences, especially with church audiences,
Mhm.
I really like emphasizing this idea of grace.
Mm.
And it's about when people are trying to explain their feelings, words are a really imperfect vehicle, especially when, you're talking and using the language of your little ecosystem, which might be offensive to someone else in a different ecosystem. And so it's tough,
Yeah.
right? You're gonna be a little offensive, and I tell people that someone will probably offend you a little bit, but just give them the grace that they're trying to do their best in what
Yes.
they're expressing.
I think we need so much more of that. And I kind of tried to figure that out in the book I wrote, Trust Your Mind. But it's just so baffling the way we have let ourselves get outraged over like the wrong word usage on both sides, probably a little bit more on the left. I think the left really struggles with that. The right has their own sort of like trigger words, but it's not as much. I don't feel like on the right it's tied as much to vocabulary. What do you think?
I tend to think that people are the same on both sides, and you just have to pick which which maybe words you're thinking about or which context. So I think about comedy, and I remember after 9/11, maybe it was Bill Maher made a joke about something, and I think there was a lot of outrage on the right, and certainly after Charlie Kirk as well. There's a lot of outrage too about specific things you can say. I think you're right on the left. There's kind of specific terms that that you can or can't say, and these things are evolving.
Mhm.
Um, But at the end of the day, I think it's useful to think about what are the people's perceptions of harm. And so I
Hmm.
think people on the left think that, well, if you're using these terms, it's a slippery slope into oppression. And I think on the right, people think if you're using, making certain jokes, it's a slippery slope into, the loss of civility and not caring about, violence or things like this. So,
Hmm.
but I think it is not as slippery as a slope as people assume, to your point, right? Like just because you use a word doesn't mean that we're going to devolve into the purge and start killing each other, right? Or we
Right.
don't care about the rights of vulnerable populations.
Right, right, right. Yeah. So on that note, I know that you're also looking at misinformation, which is interesting because I feel like misinformation is a different aspect of all of this. Like I think, when you're talking about moral harm and how we perceive one another, and we're all, we basically agree on a lot of things, but we kind of get, anal, for lack of a better word, about like those small things, like the tiles. Misinformation feels like a different beast in terms of, what a researcher might be taking on. Can you tell me more about, what you're looking at in terms of misinformation?
Sure. So it's a field that I'm just starting to get into, but there is a ton of great work on it. And it, some of the, I think, coolest work is more philosophical,
Mm.
the stuff that really gets me interested. And it's really about what is the nature of truth and what is the nature of truth in people's minds when they share something. So I think of flat earthers, which is, a philosophy and a scientific understanding that I think all scientists would say is kind of ridiculous. And when people join flat earther communities, it's unclear like how deep that belief goes. Like if you're a flat earther, I think you probably still go on a cruise if someone gave it to you for free, right? Here's like a $10,000 to go on a Disney cruise, and all you have to do is sail around a little bit. I think you'd think, well, I think you're probably all right. We're probably not going to sail off the edge of the earth. And so we can believe things for the sake of sharing them on social media or for
Mhm.
the sake of belonging to a group or showing that we are more enlightened or more of a free thinker than someone else. But maybe we don't believe it in a really deep way. And so I think interventions to get at this, I think kind of have to meet people where they're at and think of their motivations for sharing things and think about how people think things are actually true. And so there's a bunch of work showing that people will share things if they think the gist is right on social media, even if they don't think that every little fact is true. And
Mhm.
so little things like corrections that are on Twitter, like, is this really, really true? Or think about the kind of facts can be useful, but I don't think hit at the heart of misinformation, which is this desire to share things that we think are, tells the right kind of narrative or right story.
Mhm. Okay, this is really interesting. I hadn't thought too much about this. So what's coming to my mind is, like in the field of psychology or, as a journalist, for me, and I, report on psychology, I know there's talk of like, how do you really get to the heart of what someone thinks or feels, especially in online settings, because there's so much self-censoring, self-silencing, etc. People are not always honest or upfront. So in a sense, that's a kind of emotional misinformation, if you will. I don't know if you're looking
Mm-hmm.
at that. And I know that that presents problems for researchers who are trying to get a sense of, what people really think or feel, which obviously you could do in a more private setting and not just um, glean from online. But is that what you're kind of referring to here? Like in terms of misinformation, people are concealing things, and that's yeah, walk me through this.
Yeah, I like the idea of emotional misinformation. When it comes to concealing, that seems very intentional to me. Like you're, hiding something in the palm of your hand and trying to make
Mhm.
sure no one knows it's there. I don't think it's that intentional when it comes to sharing misinformation. I think it's more, yeah, that sounds about right. Like maybe you
Okay.
haven't thought about it really deeply, but it's just
Hmm.
something that aligns with your moral values and with your positions in the group. Like I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and I
Okay.
think I haven't checked that this is actually true, but I think it's like the gist is right.
So you're
So,
referring to when people share other things, like links to things or stories and that kind of thing, not when they're sharing their own experiences with.
sorry, that's right. That's right.
Okay,
But I
okay.
think, but it's a good point because I think even with personal experiences, you could say, well, maybe this isn't like exactly relevant to the policy debates that we're having. But
Mhm.
there's a truth inherent in this story. So if let's say you're walking home, you have a gun in your pocket, and you're walking home, and it feels like someone's kind of following you, and you kind of turn around and maybe you like place your hand on your hip to show them that you're not afraid or something, and then they cross the street. Like, is that relevant to the broader gun debate? Is that relevant to how many people are injured with guns or how many people defend themselves? Maybe, like nothing really happened, but there's an emotional truth there. And so when
Mhm.
you share that, I think there's a sense that your story is true. And so when people share those stories on social media and then you share them or say like, oh, this is why we need guns, right? I think that there is a kind of tenuous connection between the statistics and like what feels like it's right. And maybe to hit this point home or just use a different analogy, I think about the truth of stories. I spend a lot of time, reading to my kids, and you might read Cinderella, reading Cinderella to my daughter. And is Cinderella true? I mean, in some sense, maybe there was like a real, there's lots of kids who have to live with their step parents, and maybe their step parents are jerks, you know? But is Cinderella true in like the actual factual sense that like there was actually a little girl named, who's called Cinder Girl? Probably not. But like we share this story and we read it to our kids because we're like, there's a deep truth here, right? That it
Mhm.
can be hard to live with step parents and that people get their comeuppance eventually, and that if you're good and virtuous, eventually, like you'll get saved. Is that really true? I don't know. Again, but like it resonates with us. So I think,
Mhm.
is that misinformation? Is Cinderella misinformation? No, but like it's also not true in a strict sense.
Well, this is really interesting because then now I'm thinking of just mythology, right? Like just this, ancient tradition passing on myths and oral history and,
Hmm.
storytelling and that kind of thing, which in a way, I guess you could call that misinformation if it's been embellished over time, right? It's just now that we have the vehicle of the internet, it just takes on a whole life of its own. So I guess it seems like it's important to parse these things out because there's so much value in stories and storytelling and gleaning lessons, right, from sharing powerful stories. But then facts are equally important for a different set of reasons. Obviously, just so we all are like have a historically accurate sense of things, and so we can all kind of be on the same page. But I guess these things get blurred, especially in our online climate. So are you like, what are you looking at specifically? Are you looking at how facts get kind of blurred with myth, or are you looking at people's relationship to misinformation?
Yeah, great questions. I love the idea of myths as misinformation. I mean, imagine you go back to ancient times or some shamanic society, and you're like,
Mhm.
fake news. The world was not created this way, and
Uh-huh.
it's just an analogy, and you should not think about it as the truth. I think. I think we should one put aside that there are elites. I mean, I think the real problem with misinformation is often like there are just elites who are spreading lies. Those can be foreign adversaries. They can be
Mhm.
politicians that are trying to sway people to kind of like look one way or the other. And so I think that is real misinformation and it's intentional and it is kind of deployed as a weapon.
Mhm.
And so I think we need ways to kind of figure that out, right? Find ways to kind of the supply side, for instance, right? Punish people who use fake news or find them accountable legally. But I think for everyday people who are believing things or sharing things online or things like this, right? Then I think it's really about their their relationship to it, their feeling that it is true, even if it's not factually true. And to go back about, our deepest beliefs and kind of who has a mind, like these things are in some ways constructed and they're in some ways, I don't want to say fiction, but I think let's use another example. Let's think about like your dog and like how much of mind does your dog have? And I think if it, people are like, oh, my dog loves this, and they're feeling super excited about this, and they have a rich human mind, like people kind of anthropomorphize their dog in powerful ways. But then if it came time to say, well, someone has to do your taxes in your family, no one's like, let's give Rover, my taxes to do, because we all know Rover is not as smart as a human being. And so I think there's a difference between like generally how we feel emotionally about things. And if you really stuck it to someone and they had to make a hard choice, then they would make the right choice. And so maybe we need to find more ways in our environment to get people to kind of make not just the intuitive emotional choice, but the kind of like truthiest choice where they have to reason more.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think about this a lot. And, I wrote a bit about, just kind of the vital urgency of debate and debate training and how it's something that's missing in our schools. And I didn't have a debate club in school. I went to public schools in San Francisco, and I was raised very religious, actually, and I kind of had to learn these things later in life, and I'm so grateful I did. But I wish that I learned these things earlier, and I mean, I was raised in a very kind of intellectual household as well, so there was a lot of talking and analyzing, and I think that that really helped me. Um, but I think there's something that is so empowering when people um, are able to sit with uncertainty and really parse apart the nuance of information or arguments, which is hard to do in any kind of groupy environment. I would say. I mean, I think you also
Mhm.
kind of grew up in diverse kind of religious experiences, is my memory, right?
I mean, my folks were not particularly religious, but we went to church a fair amount. We traveled and went to church in those places. And so I had a kind of outsider perspective, I think,
Okay.
that helped because I could be like, well, this is not my deep beliefs, but I can understand the coherence of these beliefs and why they make sense. So I feel like I grew up a little bit as an anthropologist, which
Right.
helped in many ways. But uh, I feel like to play devil's advocate, which is, in some sense what we're all about,
Yeah.
like there is a suspicion of people who play anthropologists or even debaters, right? I did a little bit of debate in my public school in Canada. And there's something weird about being able to take either position and just defend it as much as you
Um,
can as a gun for hire or like where's your real convictions? Because you
yeah.
could say, well, actually you're in this position. You're like, okay, I'm going to defend this as much as I can. And so the balance that I think about or that people ask me about when I give these talks is like, sure, you can engage with the other side. You can kind of, it's about ideas, but then like, what about the deep moral convictions? And
Mhm.
do you lose those convictions if you find yourself arguing on both sides sometimes? And I don't feel like I have, but I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I do think about this a lot. Okay, what I found in my reporting and when I was doing these interviews, which was very moving, was people did feel like they lost a sense of naivete, like a sense of idealism about the world, because I think when you have a strong conviction about something, that's like very energizing, right? And you see the world in a little bit more black and white, kind of gives you a sense of adrenaline. You're like, this is the right way, and there's so much power and energy in that. versus these kids who got very serious about debate. They would hear their peers talking about some kind of social issue, and they just couldn't relate to them anymore because they were
Hmm.
just so used to seeing so much nuance and kind of like being able to see both sides of something. So, I mean, personally, I think there's a lot of beauty in that. I think that a lot of life is very uncertain and it is hard to kind of land on one side or the other. I think it's the easier route for sure to kind of land on one side or the other. That being said, I mean, yeah, I think everyone is entitled to find their conviction, right? Even if
Hmm.
it's a tiny bit one direction or the other, right? It can be enough to kind of be like make an assessment of something, this is right or this is wrong. Um,
Like you're still going to vote, right? I mean, I feel this way.
right.
Like I'm
Yeah,
less outraged at the world because I understand the nuance and I understand people on the other side and why they vote the way they do. But I'm still going to vote a particular way based on my convictions.
exactly. So, and me too, but I will be honest and I would say I voted with a lot less enthusiasm after learning these skills. I think it was very different from being a kind of idealistic teenager or 20 something so yeah. So what is like the practical application of all of this, all of these thoughts and analysis on misinformation? Like, because you mentioned kind of helping people think through things with more reason. Are some of the groups that you're partnering with focused on this, like helping people assess things a little bit more rationally?
It's a great question. So I think there's maybe two levels of connecting with this idea and the problem of misinformation. There are some groups like New Public that are trying to start new social media initiatives, new platforms. I'm working with this group called Sandbox. So for folks who are listening, sandbox.app is an app where you can kind of like have conversations among social, on social media with people who disagree and kind of explore the issues. And it's a really powerful way of doing this debate and being informed and thinking analytically. And so there's that, right? Like, how do we change the algorithms? How do we change the platforms to discourage misinformation? But then I think there's the kind of more personal way, which is how do you get people to think about information more critically? How do you get them to ultimately like engage maybe less with social media or in different ways? And so I have a study with some folks. Stephen Ratchey is the lead author. He's going to be a professor at CMU soon. And what he does is gets people to unsubscribe from 100 of the most divisive accounts on X. And we all know what those accounts are. They're like the guilty pleasure where we like log on. We're like, I'm so mad, because of this person. And you're like, I don't even know if it's true, but I'm just like mad. And like you said earlier, right? Like there's kind of like this energeticness from engaging and being angry, and you feel like you see the world as it truly is. But of course, then you log off and you just feel like tired and dead inside. And so if you get people to unsubscribe from these accounts and instead subscribe to things like pictures of space or cats, people are still just as informed about the world, except they're just less angry, right? And they're less likely to kind of rage at each other on the internet. So I think it takes some personal responsibility. Oftentimes we're like, well, how do we change society? And I think, you write about this well, right? We need to take some personal responsibility for like how we are and why we're getting offended and how we're dealing with the world. And so I think each of us can be like, look, I'm going to interact differently, not only have some grace with how other people are acting and speaking, but also I just need to change how I consume media and what I read and what I do.
Okay. Yeah, I think wow, that's amazing. I've definitely noticed that. Yeah, as I was telling you earlier, and some of my readers know, I live in Nepal now. And so it's a place that I've spent many years in previously. And it's really amazing how just changing your environment changes how you feel, changes your perceptions. Tangibly too, I think, living in a big, bustling, kind of emerging capital, um, the the touch points are very different. I talk about this with my husband a lot. Like we lived in the suburbs of Northern California before. It was just like very quiet, and so much of humanity is like not in your face, but here it's like it's so in your face and it's so amazing and beautiful and it's like I feel so much more grounded, I think, as a result. And so some of what you're describing reminds me of that, like looking at pictures of space or looking at pictures of trees or flowers or like nature. It's just like a way to kind of get back in touch with your own humanity. Like, is that the goal?
I think so. I mean, so you can certainly get this from, nature, but I think you're absolutely right that it's about reconnecting with humanity. And this is where I think of the work of Nick Epley and his studies show that we really underestimate the power of just social connection and
Mhm.
how positive it feels to reach out, right? To send an email to a friend that you haven't seen for a couple years, or just thank someone that you run into on the street for doing something kind, like holding the door. And so I think that's changed how he lives his life, and his research has changed how I live my life in a large part because I try to talk to people or even just mention something really small, like, hey, I saw this guy at a restaurant the other day, and I just said, nice sneaks. So he had cool shoes on, right? And he feels good, for the rest of the night. And he goes home and he's like, yeah, these sneakers were a good purchase. They are awesome, right? We put so much thought into what we do and how we act in the world. And so just a little glimmer of positivity can really change someone's day. And I think, and then they're kinder to other people. And not to, overestimate, it's not going to make this world a utopia. But I think making someone's day a little better and making your day better because of that is real powerful.
Yes, definitely. So are you going more in, yeah, like which direction are you going in now? You've just settled in Ohio. Are you kind of wanting to go more in the misinformation direction or yeah, what lies ahead for you?
So I think I'll still study polarization. That's where I kind of come from in recent years, and I've got all these connections with practitioners. But I'm leading this initiative at OSU on both polarization and misinformation. And so I see myself going more towards misinformation. But there's lots of folks who've already studied it and the kind of more practical tips for misinformation. So changing algorithms or nudges, right? These kind of social psychological things. And again, what really fascinate me are these kind of deeper philosophical questions, epistemology, like what is true
Mhm.
and how do we determine the truth as people and as a society and in relationships. So that's probably where I'll go. I think just because those are the big questions.
Yeah, and using AI to kind of figure these things out. Like, can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. So this is not my work, but I think it's super interesting. Tom Costello is the first author on this paper, and they use ChatGPT to talk to conspiracy theorists. Have you heard of this paper?
I don't think I have, no.
It's super interesting. Conspiracy theorists like have a session with GPT, and they believe, let's say 9/11 was an inside government job. And these researchers got GPT to just like leverage all the facts that it could. And so people were like, well, here's the temperature at which steel melts. And so it couldn't have been, jet fuel. And then GPT will say, well, actually, jet fuel gets up to this temperature when it burns. And like, here's the way that steel girders are meant to like support weight. And if you like heat them enough, they'll deform it, whatever, right? So all these facts. And the crazy thing is, after 15 minutes of talking to GPT, which is non-judgmental, but also has the world of facts at its fingertips, people are less likely to endorse conspiracy theories by a big chunk. Like for behavioral studies, it's a big effect size. And so we talk a lot about how AI can misinform, you can make fake videos, but I think there's really a power for AI to correct people, right? It knows the science
Mhm.
and it's not judgmental. And so you can have AI kind of like lead us to the path of goodness if people are sufficiently motivated and if we implement it in the right way. So I think that's super interesting that you can use facts and they're effective. And kind of my ongoing work is more about how can we put not just get AI to work with the human mind, but how can we put the human mind in AI?
Mhm.
Because AI works in ways that we don't even understand, even people who design it. There's like a billion floating points in an LLM. But like we can program in human cognition into AI and have it make judgments and moral judgments more like people do. And I've got work showing that people, trust that system more if it's more like a human. So I kind of want to make more AI not just more humane, but also ultimately more human because we trust it more.
Okay, and what does that look like? I mean, I feel this conversation has been around for some time, right? Like I'm thinking of Ruha Benjamin at Princeton, and there was another person, Joy, I'm forgetting her last name. She was at MIT, and they were really focused on making sure that reducing racial bias in
Mm.
algorithms, so this was like maybe 10, 15 years ago. So the conversation around AI and the inputs with AI is, obviously more new. But yes, like what does it look like to make AI more human?
Yeah. I mean, so I certainly agree that it's important to de-bias AI and make it more just. Although, you know, in some ways these goals can be at odds with each other because people are biased, right? People are sometimes petty, and so how much of the bias within AI is due to the fact that there's bias within people, and those are the training sets that we're
Right.
using. But I agree, it's totally important to de-bias AI, not just from our petty vices, but also our cultural biases. So,
Mhm.
how much of Nepal is in a training set for American LLMs, right? Probably not very much. But I think the work that I'm doing is more focused on kind of how does human cognition work? And this is something that we know so much about from years and years of social and cognitive psychology. And I study moral judgments and moral cognition. And so the work that I'm talking about is about, look, we know we have a harm-based moral mind. We know how we make judgments. We know how we, you know, understand whether something's immoral or not based on comparing it to a template in our mind, right? So there's all these kind of like lower level things that we know about how minds work. And you can just prompt AI to kind of act or think in ways that correspond to how our human minds think. And it turns out that if you do that, not only are AI systems better at mimicking human morality, for instance, but people trust them more because they know that it's thinking like a human would. So if a human tells you, you're like, oh, I'm not sure what to do in my life. Like, should I tell my sister-in-law something that she doesn't want to hear
Mhm.
because I think it's the right thing to do at the next Thanksgiving? I'm like having a moral kind of like tension about this. Or should I tell my friend that her husband's cheating on, right? There's all these kind of like moral things that we're not sure how we should think about them. Turns out that AI is really good at thinking of what we should do, but we don't trust it because it's like not thinking of it like a human would. So you
Mhm.
tell it to think of like a human. Now people are like, oh, okay, I'll listen to it and I'll do better, more ethical things in my life because I know it's thinking like a human being.
Okay, so but in that situation, like, is there a right outcome? Because to be like really human, there would be a variety of responses, or does it depend on the input? Like, would the AI need to ask a bunch of follow-up questions to in order to give the answer of yes or no, you should talk to your sister or your friend about X, Y, and Z, excuse me.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because morality is ultimately up for each of us to decide. I think, and you're right, it's not like AI is super good at cancer screening and better
Hmm.
than human doctors usually. And so there's a there, right? Like a tumor is
Yeah.
cancerous or not. But I do think when it comes to the morals of AI, right, that we often get blinded to the possibility space that might exist, which is why people write to Ann Landers or whoever, right? We want to know what an expert thinks so we can think about the possibility space. And we
Mhm.
almost want permission to make the hard choice, right? So we know it might be better for the world and for our lives and for ethics if we do the hard thing, if we speak up, whatever. But I
Mhm.
think it can be hard to have the courage to do that unless we have an expert tell us that this is a reasonable thing to do. And it's something that some might consider really more, right? So maybe it's awkward to have this conversation about someone, but it's the right thing to do, we know in our hearts, and so an expert might license that. And so if we know that an AI is like thinking like a human being, then it could be more like we go to a trusted friend or an advisor whose advice we'll take and we should take, if only, right, we knew the AI was thinking like a human.
So is this going to streamline morality then? Is this going to get people more on the same page? Do you know what I mean? It's almost like this is kind of out there, okay, but it's kind of like how religion functions. Religion gets people on the same page with a similar code of beliefs so that in an ideal sense, I guess people are making very similar decisions about different situations. So do you think that that is kind of the promise that AI holds, kind of getting people closer together in a sense? Or will the nuance and the contextual awareness always be there so that when humans are being advised about their decisions, outcomes are always going to be different? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's a yeah, really interesting question. I guess you could see, religions in two ways. One is the dogmatic way, which is like, this is right, and this holy book reinforces our group values, even if those group values are minimally different from other groups and perhaps petty. Right. So I think of the troubles in Northern Ireland, right? Most people are like, if you're not Christian, you're like, whatever, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. But I think that, in Northern Ireland, those differences were really powerful. And religion there reinforced these kind of deep socio-cultural differences that existed for a long time, right? Or like the schism between various sects in all sorts of religious contexts. So there, like religion is a tool to justify divisions and not a way to bring us together. Even if it coheres around a specific set of values, it's not like a really like a let's make the world a better place. But then there's the religious sense where there's a overarching set of principles, the golden rule,
Mhm.
right? Love your enemies, that encourage people to reflect on how to apply that in their lives. So I think of the best sermons on Sunday are not telling you this is what you should do, but here's a story, right? Here's a parable, and here's how you should think about it in your life and apply it and like do the work, right? Going back to, what you've long talked about, right? Do the work to think about what is the right thing to do and how to apply this and like have some internal debate, right? There, I think AI could be really useful.
Mhm.
As far as I've used it, right, it doesn't tell you the right decision. It tells you like, here's the context, here's some ways to think about it, here's some perspectives. And I think we need to make those perspectives even broader. But my
Mhm.
hope is that it gives us a toolkit or a
Mhm.
broader frame to think about it and arrive at something that is not the right answer, but the answer that feels right to us and our communities and that makes us better.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of like a thinking partner. And I could see how that would be so valuable for people who don't have many thinking partners in their lives or don't have individuals that they trust or that they feel like they can rely on. Yeah, that's such an interesting thought. It's a beautiful thought. Yeah, I can see how it is in line with your other research interests and kind of like it feels like another avenue to kind of bring people together or bring people more in alignment with their own sense of things, right? Their own sense of morality and be able to kind of live their lives with integrity, which is
That's
amazing.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an optimist and I think we're both in the business of like, how can we, make the world a better place, not by forcing some external truth on people, but getting them to think harder about divergent ideas, right? And about like what makes sense for them. But you have to consider the whole possibility space thoughtfully.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that's a great, like, hopeful note for us to end on. I'm so grateful for our conversation, and I want everyone to check out your work, read your book, and yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.